The dust of the Texas trail tasted like despair on Elara's tongue. It coated the inside of her throat, a gritty reminder of everything she had left behind. The genteel poverty of Georgia, the memory of a husband lost to a fever, and the ghost of a life that had promised so much and delivered so little. Now she was here in the vast, intimidating expanse of the Wyoming territory, standing on the porch of a man who was more myth than man. Silas the Oak Morgan was not merely tall. He was a monument of sinew and solitude. He seemed hewn from the very land he commanded, his shoulders broad enough to block the setting sun, his hands calloused maps of a lifetime of labor. When his shadow fell over her, it didn't just dim the light, it felt like a physical weight. "Elara," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in her chest. It wasn't a question. "Mr. Morgan," she whispered, her own voice fragile as a sparrow's in comparison. He had paid for her passage. He had seen her advertisement, a widow, desperate, seeking a new beginning, and he had responded with a blunt letter and a bank draft. This was the transaction. Her youth, her company, for his protection and a roof over her head. A business arrangement between strangers. The wedding was a quiet, hurried affair in front of a traveling preacher. There were no flowers, no music, only the sigh of the wind and the judge's mumbled words. Silas placed a simple gold band on her finger, his touch so careful it felt like he was handling spun glass. That night, in the log house that was now hers by law, he showed her to a separate bedroom. "The house is sturdy. You'll be safe here," he said, his gaze lingering on the single stubborn tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. For weeks, they lived in a state of tense, polite coexistence. Elara cooked and cleaned, trying to impose order on his world of raw masculinity. Silas worked from dawn until dusk, a silent, moving mountain on the horizon. But his eyes, the color of a stormy sky, followed her everywhere. They weren't hungry or cruel, but intensely observant, as if he were trying to solve a complex puzzle. The breaking point came on a day a rattlesnake found its way onto the porch. Elara froze, a scream trapped in her throat. Silas moved with a speed that belied his size, dispatching the creature with a single, brutal strike of his shovel. The adrenaline, the fear, and the weeks of silent suffering broke her. She sank to her knees, sobbing, not for the snake, but for her dead husband, for her lost life, for the terrifying, lonely future. Silas knelt before her, his presence overwhelming. He didn't touch her, but his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. "Elara," he murmured, "this grief you carry for a ghost. It's a chain. You're here in the flesh and blood. This land demands the same." He finally reached out, his thumb, rough as sandstone, wiping a tear from her cheek. The gesture was so tender it stole her breath. And then his voice dropped to a whisper, a low, possessive vow that was part warning, part promise, and it curled deep in her belly. "I have been patient, little wife. I have given you time to mourn. But make no mistake. This is your home now. I am your husband now. And I will stretch you," he whispered, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made the world shrink to just the two of them on that dusty porch. "I will stretch you across this wide land and fill up all the empty, lonely spaces inside you until you forget you were ever anyone else's. Until his name is just a whisper you can't quite recall." The words hung in the air between them, a seismic shift in the fragile geography of their marriage. "I will stretch you until you forget your husband's name." They should have terrified her. They were a threat, a declaration of conquest. And yet, something dormant and yearning within Elara stirred in response. It was the first time anyone had spoken to her with such fierce, undeniable intent since she'd become a ghost in her own life. The very next day, Silas began his campaign not with force, but with a quiet, relentless presence. He started taking her with him on his rounds. He didn't ask, he simply stated, "You're coming," and held out a hand to help her onto the wagon. He showed her the land not as a hostile force, but as a living entity. He pointed out where the wildflowers would bloom in spring, the hidden creek where the water ran sweet and cold, the ancient gnarled oak that had served as a landmark for generations of his family. He taught her to identify the calls of the meadowlarks and the warning cry of a hawk. The vastness that had once terrified her began to feel less like a prison and more like a kingdom. One afternoon, as they mended a stretch of fence together, he stood behind her, his chest to her back, his huge hands covering her smaller ones as she struggled to hold a post steady. "Like this," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. His strength flowed into her, guiding her movements, making the difficult task effortless. Her heart hammered against her ribs, not from fear, but from the shocking intimacy of the contact. He was a furnace of heat and muscle, and for a fleeting moment, she let herself lean back into that solid strength. He didn't move away. He simply held her there, surrounded, safe. That night, he didn't retreat to his chair after supper. He sat beside her on the settee, his thigh a solid line of heat against hers. He asked her about Georgia, about the books she liked to read. His questions were blunt, but his listening was deep. He was, she realized, learning her, mapping the terrain of her mind as diligently as he knew his own land. The unraveling of her old life was a quiet, internal thing. It happened not in a dramatic moment, but in 1,000 small ones. The memory of her first husband, William, began to change. He was no longer the center of her grief, but a cherished sepia-toned photograph from a past life. His face, once so vivid in her dreams, became softer, the details less sharp. One evening, as Silas gently brushed her hair, a ritual he had started without fanfare, she tried to summon William's smile. It was there, a flicker of a kind, gentle face. But it was overshadowed by the reflection in the dark windowpane, the giant, silent man behind her, his focus entirely on the task of caring for her, his touch saying more than words ever could. The ghost was fading, replaced by the overwhelming, tangible reality of the man who was patiently, methodically, claiming her. The first snow came early, a silent white blanket that hushed the world. It was on such a night, with the wind howling like a lone wolf outside, that the final wall around Elara's heart crumbled. They were sitting before the roaring fireplace, and Silas was telling her about the first herd of cattle he'd driven north as a young man, his voice a steady, comforting rhythm. Elara watched the firelight play over the stark plains of his face, highlighting the quiet strength, the loneliness he never spoke of, the deep, abiding kindness he showed in his actions, not his words. This man, who could break a wild stallion with his will alone, handled her with a reverence that made her feel precious. Without thinking, she reached out and placed her hand over his. He stilled, his story halting. His stormy eyes found hers, filled with a question so raw and vulnerable it took her breath away. "Silas," she said, her voice steady for the first time since she'd arrived. "Tell me again. What you said on the porch." He understood immediately. A slow heat kindled in his gaze. He turned his hand, engulfing hers, his thumb stroking her palm. He leaned in close, his voice a low, intimate growl that resonated in her very bones. "I will stretch you, Elara," he repeated, the promise now a familiar, thrilling melody. "I will stretch you across this bed and fill the emptiness you've carried for so long. I will stretch your heart until it knows only my name." This time there was no fear, only a profound, aching need. She met his gaze, her own filled with a certainty that had been months in the making. "Then do it," she whispered. "Make me forget." He stood, and in one fluid, powerful motion, he lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing. He carried her to his room, their room, and laid her on the buffalo robes before the fire. His touch was not that of a conqueror, but of a worshipper. He explored her not as territory to be claimed, but as a sacred text to be learned by heart. He was true to his word. With every slow, deliberate caress, with every whispered endearment against her skin, he stretched her perception of pleasure. He filled her senses until there was no room for ghosts, no space for past sorrows. Later, as they lay tangled together in the warm aftermath, the storm outside finally quieted. He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Elara," he breathed, her name a prayer on his lips. And in the profound peace that settled over her, she realized she had to search for it. She had to consciously reach back into the shadows of her memory to find the name that had once defined her. William. It was there, a distant, fond memory, a part of her history, but it held no power over her present. It no longer held her heart. She turned in his arms, curling into the immense, safe fortress of his body. She looked up into the face of the giant cowboy who had warned her, promised her, and then so tenderly made good on his vow. "Silas," she said, her voice clear and full of a love that had grown root-deep in the soil he had prepared for it. "My name is Elara Morgan." A slow, devastating smile spread across his face, the first true, unguarded smile she had ever seen from him. It transformed him from a monument into a man. Her man. He pulled her closer, and in the safety of his embrace, the virgin bride was gone, replaced by a woman who was wholly, completely, and unforgettably his.